are all muted and you can hear me, right? Okay, good. My participants list here. So welcome everybody. It's just 2 nights ago that we had the Emeriti lecture, and although this Zoom format has many things we don't like about it, it does allow us to reach a lot of people, and we had over 400 participants for Joel Premack's Emeriti lecture. So really kind of an all-time record for that event. We'll have the second Emeriti lecture will come in April. So tentatively, well, that should be Paul Lubeck from Politics, and Paul's title is, his tentative title anyway, is Nigeria 2050, Mapping the Demographic Transformation of an Emerging Regional Power. So that will be quite interesting, and certainly everything points to another Zoom meeting for the April meeting. We don't meet in December, but we will meet again in January, and our speaker then will be Rebecca Covarrubias. She's in psychology, and Rebecca has been working on the question of how first-generation students, minority students, et cetera, deal with their college education. The point being that there are some differences in the way they hear their education. And from all reports, Rebecca is a really good speaker, really interesting topic. So hope to see you all there. Let me mention just a couple of kind of items of news that relates to all of us. So this, well, let me put it this way, twice a year, all of the Emeriti associations from the different campuses, Council of University of California Emeriti Association, CUSIA, meets with all of the staff retirees associations. And they rotate campuses, and the fall was our turn, Santa Cruz's turn. Now, it turned out to be a virtual meeting, but still it worked out well, kind of showcased the campus in some ways. The dominant topic of that meeting was the problems with RASC. That's the Retirement Administration Service Center, and you may have heard about this. And it's been going on really for pretty much a year or more. The core of it, really two things. One is a couple of years back, the university switched its main database for the entire UC system and generated what's called the Redwood system. And that just doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And so there's a problem just getting the core data. You know, when were you hired? What was your salary? What's your contact information? All of that. It's being improved, but they still have problems. And then of course, the second problem is as all of you know, we used to be able to go down and see somebody on campus and talk to them about a retirement. Now it's centralized, and they just really haven't gotten it under control. So there's a lot being done. So Todd Whitkey is working on a program to track survivors. Judith Asen has really done a nice report recently with Committee on Emeriti Relations on recent experience with people newly retired. And then kind of fortunately for us, you know, Roger Anderson is chair of the whole UC Emeriti Benefits Committee. And so they're very much making this #1 issue too. And the one thing I want to add to that is that you should be aware of the fact that we now, although we don't handle all the paperwork for retirees on campus, we do have a retirement center, Retirement and Emeriti Center. And the director of that center is Christy Dawley. You've all probably seen Christy because when we were meeting in person, she would help with check-in, and Christy is here today. Hello. So if you have questions, please think of going to Christy. Christy has really made this retirement, the REC, the Retirement and Emeriti Center, a really functional office on campus. Now she's not going to be the one to deal with your problem, but she can send you in the right direction. and so just keep that in mind if these issues come up. think about Christy. Also, you can contact me, you can contact Judith. And we are indeed working hard to try to do something about this. I don't know. Christy, Judith, do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, I would, and I hope everyone can hear me. Please tell me if I'm not loud enough. So my name is Christy Dolly. I'm the coordinator for the Retirees and Emeriti Center. And absolutely, any issue that you're having, either in communicating with RASC or not knowing the correct resources or not hearing a response, please reach out to my office, the Retiree and Emeriti Center. It also helps me get a sense of, are these a few issues, or is it a larger trend that I can bring up with RASC that there might be an issue within the system? So I'm happy to help, and please reach out to me as needed.
Okay. Okay, good. Any questions about that? If you got a question, you can unmute yourself and ask. Okay, good. All right, we're looking into it as best we can. All right, last thing, let me just say, as you probably know, the campus has created its own testing center for the coronavirus. And Jeremy Stanford, who's in MCD biology, has really been at the core of this. He sent an email around yesterday just telling people that they've really ramped up their ability to test large numbers of samples. And so if you need a coronavirus test and want it done quickly, the great virtue of it is they actually know the results the same day. And this is the good test. You know, there's the quick test that's sometimes wrong, and there's the better test, PCR-based test, that is more accurate. So I'm looking into the details of it, but it looks like if you've got a UCSC ID, you know, if you can check books out of the library, you'll probably be able to get this test on campus. And you do the swab yourself. It's not painful. You just do your own swab, put it in a tube, it goes off somewhere. So if you have questions about that, you can send me an email. It might be a nice resource for us. All right. So any questions about Emeriti business, etc.? I think I've covered everything I want to. So let's turn to something that's fun and educational now. We'll turn to today's speaker. Today's speaker is distinguished Professor Carolyn Dean, known to many of us as Lindy. Okay, she is in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture. So Lindy was an undergraduate at the University of Puget Sound. Did you grow up in that part of the world, Lindy?
Yes, I am from Washington State.
Okay, and then did her graduate education, MA, PhD at UCLA. She works on the cultural history of the Americas, both after colonization and before colonization. And today she's going to talk us about a fascinating title, Social Stones and Homicidal Rocks, the Meaning in Inka Masonry. So Lindy, it's all yours.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So there we go. So you'll all let me know if something goes wrong with the screen or you can't hear me.
Yes.
Because I am now speaking into the great void. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Barry, for the invitation to speak, and I'll be joining your ranks in probably 5 or 6 years. So I'm looking forward to that. So my primary research has been on aspects of Inca visual culture. Oh, whoops. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, so I'm having trouble. Oh, all right. I was having trouble advancing my slide, but I think it's working now. All right, so hopefully it will keep working. This map shows you the Inca Empire when it was at its height in the 16th century, and Inca visual culture is my primary area of research. Cusco, the Inca's capital city, is in the highlands of what is today the nation of Peru. And my early work, my dissertation work, and then the first decade really beyond that, focused on descendants of Inca rulers under Spanish colonial authority. Men like these who evoked their heritage in dress and regalia that they donned on special occasions as a way of bolstering their positions at the top of the indigenous socio-political hierarchy. This kind of research was largely archival, and so was carried out in various state archives, including those at the National University in Cusco, Peru. I thought you might enjoy seeing how the university in Cusco values its history department, especially those of you who work on historical topics. We used to call this the Bollo de Historia, which means the history hut. It is not actually as bad as it looks. The focus of research in the university's chemical engineering building, which is the dominant building in this photograph, actually focuses on the production of chocolate and the development of cacao products. So you can imagine the aroma that settles around this part of campus. Right, so this is where I conducted my early research, but frequent strikes preparing me for my experience at UCSC often meant that the university in Cusco was closed, which meant the archives were closed. So on those days, which sometimes stretched into weeks and which sometimes stretched into months, I explored Inca sites dating to the period before the Spanish invasion. Sites like this one, Tambo Machay, which is an easy day's hike out of Cusco. Now, before I left for Peru, I prepared, right? I was a good student. I dutifully did my background reading, not just on the colonial period, but on the period of Inca autonomy as well. In so doing, I formed expectations about what I would see based on what I had read. And this is an example. I'm hoping that my typing is large enough that that you can all see this. I'll let you read it for yourself. But it was pronouncements like this that had led me to expect very little of visual interest in the Inca built environment. I anticipated strong, solid walls of stone, and of course, the beauty of the environmental setting, especially at places like Machu Picchu. But I had not expected Inca architecture to reveal much insight into Inca thinking. This is a second example from about 30 years later of the kinds of things that you can read about Inca architecture. In retrospect, I think assessments of this sort were heavily influenced by the lack of decoration on the outsides of buildings. In any case, nothing I had read prepared me for masonry like this. Masonry where you find well-dressed stone blocks that wrap around or seem to hug the native rock at a site, visually engaging the site itself in conversation. In this case, the rough surface of the stone outcropping interrupts the wall of finely worked masonry. As a counterpoint, Inca masons carefully removed a precisely delineated rectilinear block of stone from that same outcrop. This kind of point counterpoint or use of complementary forms as though the built environment were in dialogue with the site's natural inhabitants, that is its rocks, was a feature that I saw not just at Tambo Machay, but I saw at site after site after site. And over the course then of the next really 20 years, I visited well over 50 sites from Ecuador through Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. The importance of this will become clearer later on, but for now it may be helpful to understand that Andeans regarded in the past and still regard in the present the earth and its stony extrusions as powerful entities whose will is ignored only by the very foolish. This is another typical statement from a standard text on the Inca built environment. So this is the kind of thing I was reading, but this is the kind of thing I was seeing. So the project that has occupied me for the past 20 years has aimed to understand both what the Incas did with their built environment and why they did it. The Inca are repeatedly described as practical to the point of lacking all imagination. They are administrators. They are not artists, according to the literature. But clearly the Incas invested a lot of labor in their non-utilitarian uses of rock. To discuss aspects of what I think of as the Incas' Petrus strategy, I'm going to focus on a site that was built at the height of Inca imperial power, around 1500 of the Common Era. So this is an aerial view of the city of Cusco as you see it today. The dotted line shows you the city of Cusco at the time of the Spanish invasion in 1531. Just decades earlier, the Incas had constructed a multi-purpose complex on a promontory overlooking Cusco. Its name was and is Saxuaman. It served as a fortress, treasury, and temple. Colonial period sources, both indigenous and Spanish, indicate that it was built to defend the city and intimidate and impress visitors. Saxuaman expressed Inca invincibility, but it was also designed to be persuasive, to convey the benefits of belonging to the empire, that the trade-offs, such as the loss of political autonomy and heavy tribute payments, basically represented a good deal. I show here an aerial view of Saxuaman. Again, I'll mark its boundaries. You can see that the complex is oriented north-south. Most attention is paid by modern visitors to the site's southern portion, so that's where I'll begin. At the southern end of Saxuaman are zigzagging megalithic walls, which are justifiably renowned for their enormous size. Those who emphasize Inca practicality have suggested that megaliths saved time, substituting for dozens of smaller stones. However, the zigzag walls contain stones weighing many tons, all of which had to be transported with human labor alone from a quarry over 20 miles away. It's hard to see how that saved a lot of time or labor. It's not just the size of the stones, it's also the ways they are worked. The finest Inca stone masonry, like that of Saxuaman, which was built for state functions, was dry stone masonry, meaning that the blocks of stones were joined without the use of mortar. I'm showing you a detail so that you can see the precisions of the joins. And I'll talk a little more about masonry techniques later on. But for now, let's return to an aerial view of Saxuaman because I want to move away from the zigzag walls to consider the ways the Incas created a visual colloquy, like we saw earlier at the site of Tambo Machai, a colloquy between rock in the natural environment and the very, very well-worked walls, well-worked stone of their walls. At the north end of the site, the Incas created Coyaconcho, which, or as I'll argue in a moment, who is an outcropping of rock. Coyaconcho is a sacred entity, an earth being, to use a term coined by the anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena, who is our colleague at UC Davis. Earth beings, although seemingly inert, are sentient and capable of animacy. My aim is to place the zigzag walls and Coyaconcho back into conversation with one another. I seek to understand how this outcropping contributed to the meaning of Saxuaman overall. Also, I hope to more fully explore how the Incas mobilized their built environment as a crucial part of their imperial rhetoric, instantiating Andean values, which included, above all, the ability to work with earth beings. Recognizing the status of this stone as a living being from an Andean perspective, I understand Collaconcho both as an object and as a subject. While we might view it as a sculpted form, we ought to also consider its status as an agentic being and how that perception affected the ways the Incas dealt with it. According to indigenous sources, in the years prior to the Spanish colonization, the early 16th century, a strong-willed rock, who later gained the moniker Collaconcho, refused to cooperate with Inca builders. Expressing its willfulness, Collaconcho fell on and so killed over 3,000 native laborers who were attempting to fit it into Saxuaman's megalithic walls. A portrait of Collaconcho appears in the chronicle assembled by a Mercedarian friar named Martin de Morua. In the picture, the rock is identified as Collaconcho. It is roughly worked, squared off so that laborers using ropes can drag it along a roadbed while an Inca captain oversees the transport. The stone is also glossed saikum, a word meaning tired in the Andean language of Runasimi or Quechua. Saikum refers to a particular type of quarried rock that stubbornly refused to cooperate with imperial building efforts. Today, these are known as tired stones. Another account of a tired stone is found in the chronicle of the celebrated indigenous author and artist, Felipe Wamampoma. He is known to have worked with Morua, and based on artistic style, the depiction of Collaconcho on the left can be attributed to the hand of Wamampoma. Stories about tired stones abound in the Andes from the colonial period to the present. Although they vary in details, the accounts of tired stones all concern quarried rocks that the Incas were moving towards various construction sites when those rocks, weary from travel and upset at being relocated, began to cry tears of blood. That phrase, tears of blood, means heartfelt tears. In Morua's drawing, the roughly hewn stone possesses two good eyes. Let me signal those for you, indicating that it is sentient. In Morua, in Felipe Wamampoma's chronicle, numerous tears drip from the stone. Those are those sort of great gobulets that fall from the stone. The gloss reads, and helps explain to us what's happening. It reads, "Lloró sangre la piedra," or "the stone cried blood." According to all tired stone stories recorded in the Spanish colonial period, the sympathetic Incas, recognizing the stone's anguish at being relocated and their refusal to cooperate with Inca builders, left the weary rocks where they can be found today. We might say that tired stones, renitent and tearful, were rocks that the Incas first moved, that is literally, and then were moved by, that is, emotionally. Tired stones are familiar sights in the Andes today. Many of them can still be found in the countryside, not far from Inca roadways. They are generally roughed out, smoothed from moving along Inca roadbeds, but obviously not in their finished form. They're usually located in the vicinity of whatever building project they were intended for, reminding all those who look upon the finished Inca constructions of the labor required to move and dress the stones that ended up in Inca walls. Collaconcho represents a unique example of a tired stone since it is not a quarried rock. It is not squared off for transport along the Inca's roads. You can also see how large it is. I think there are two people who are in this particular photograph to give you a sense of its size. Rather, Collaconcho is an outcropping, meaning that it was not dragged to its present location in a quarry. Although its surface has been roughly but copiously carved with steps or step motifs, meaning that it hasn't been squared off. So again, it was apparently never obviously taken from a quarry, but not prepared for transport. These factors all suggest that Collaconcho is a legendary tired stone rather than an actual one. In other words, its identity as a tired stone was created through oral narrative rather than through the process of construction itself. Were it not for specific references in colonial period chronicles, we would likely not identify Collaconcho as a tired stone at all. According to the accounts, Collaconcho was intended to be placed in the megalithic walls of Saxuaman when it resisted. When it joined the earth at this place, that is, when it became a rocky outcropping. This accounts for its current location, close to but apart from Saxuaman's walls, walls constructed of stone blocks that apparently did not resist relocation. If tired stones could refuse Inca efforts to place them in structures, the contrary must be true of the thousands of stones that were successfully positioned in Inca walls. Surely these stones, vastly more numerous than the tired stones, cooperated with the Incas, allowing themselves to be moved, shaped, hoisted, and fit. The processing of rock from quarry to wall was labor intensive. In walls of high prestige masonry, like those of Saxuaman, the blocks of cut stone were worked to fit together without the use of mortar. Once a quarried block was roughed out, hammer stones, ever decreasing in size, were used to refine the shape. The Incas referred to processed ashlars or stone blocks as nibbled stones. And they referred to the finished product, the wall, whose blocks were finally joined without mortar, as a nibbled wall. While initial strokes of large hammerstones took great bites from the stone, gobbling its excesses, final work with smaller lithic hammers persistently nibbled away at the block to achieve the desired result. Blocks were nibbled and polished at the site of construction until they fit snugly on top of and next to their nibbled companions. The Inca technique produced masonry in which each block is unique. As a consequence, each wall of high prestige masonry is one of a kind, and each structure is distinct insofar as its masonry forms and patterning is concerned. This observation holds for both polygonal stones, like those comprising the wall on the left, or like the walls of Saxuaman, as well as the walls built with parallelepipeds, as you see on the right. If you look closely at the stones in the wall on the right, you'll see that each block is unique. Blocks are made to fit precisely in one place in a wall, whether they're polygonal or have rectangular faces. None are interchangeable. These are walls of high prestige masonry that then are distinct, not only because the rocks are from different quarries and so often vary in color and mineral composition, but also because of the ways they are worked. Some more curvilinear, others rectilinear, some with pillared surfaces, some are very flat, some heavily pitted, some surfaces more polished, and so on. The traces of the hammerstone on the surfaces of the blocks point to process, the successful working of stone to convert it from its natural pre-Inca state so as to fix it within the Inca's cultural regime. The Inca's imperial rhetoric characterized this as a taming or a civilizing of undomesticated rock. Significantly, from the state's perspective, the demonstrable ordering of rock and the efforts to order subjected populations went hand in hand. Nibbled walls, then, can be viewed as an articulation of Inca order imposed on areas subject to their rule. While the Inca state generally respected the languages, clothing styles, and indigenous shrines of those they incorporated into their empire, they also insisted on certain behaviors and practices designed to integrate foreign groups into the Inca's socio-political matrix. Individuals were, from the state's point of view, like blocks of stone, some more thoroughly nibbled than others, but each bearing the traces of the fitting process. The Incas understood and promoted themselves as great civilizers, bringing order to the lands and peoples integrated into their territory. As with the natural environment, the Incas were said to have introduced order to all the different peoples in their ever-expanding domain. Diverse ethnic groups, like the land and its stony elements, could resist Inca order. An extraordinary few, like Coyaconcho and other tired stones, might successfully resist, in other words, might rebel and even draw blood. But most would eventually comply or find their place or be placed in the empire. Thus does the nibbled wall speak to the condition of belonging in the Inca's civilized society. The nibbled wall is not only rhetorically triumphant, however, it is also eminently persuasive. And here it's probably important to understand that the most comprehensive study of the Inca built environment was written by two Venezuelan architects, published in 1977 and translated to English in 1980. Who pronounced Inca state architecture as an architecture of power. And that has been sort of the prevailing point of view, that it is all about power. And my research bears that out, but I also want to add to it that it's also an architecture of persuasion. It demonstrates to any individual viewer what great outcomes can be realized by submitting to Inca order and cooperating. There's, in other words, don't be like a tired stone, but be part of the Inca's great society. The blocks still reflect their natural selves in substance, color, and composition, the way Inca subjects still kept their sacred shrines, they kept their languages, they kept their way of dress. But these stones also bear the traces of domestication, a process that fixed them into the Inca's cultural, political, and economic systems. So people, citizens of the empire, would keep significant aspects of their identity, but also adapt themselves to Inca systems through which they created an empire that was the largest in the history of the Americas. The individual blocks in a nibbled wall testify very powerfully to the ordering activities of the state because each of those blocks was subjected to it. And the walls or structures as a whole then speak to the state's abilities because they are products of them. These are social stones, stones that cooperated with the Inca's labor demands. Together, willing stone and working man created something magnificent that could not have been done without Inca expertise. While the occasional stone might have resisted Inca efforts to tame it, most cooperated. The pecked surfaces of each nibbled ashlar bear witness to the actions taken to tame its willful nature. They are the traces of toil, of the laborious processes through which a potentially animate and even recalcitrant or rebellious being was not just turned towards Inca purposes, but fully integrated into the Inca's cultural order. Learning to see rock from an indigenous perspective, we can now see these plain, undecorated, stony surfaces as highly significant and profoundly meaningful. Now, what of Coyaconcho, that strong-willed and in fact homicidal rock? It has a well-worked but not a finely worked surface. It's a complex piece, so I'm going to limit my discussion to what we might call the step motif, which is the predominant form carved onto this particular rock. Steps or step-like patterns are one of the most frequently carved motifs found on Inca rocks in general. While in some cases, the carving of steps was functional, facilitating passage onto and across the surface of rocks, in most cases, the steps are clearly non-utilitarian, with the steps being too small for use by the human foot or beginning at an inaccessible part of the rock and leading to no obviously desirable destination. And that seems to have been the case with most of the steps on Coyaconcho. At many of these sites, the steps appear near crevices or passages through the rock. Step patterns are also carved in association with caves. One of the best known examples is found at the so-called Royal Mausoleum beneath the Temple of the Sun at the site of Machu Picchu. Here we find a flight of steps at its entrance, and you might notice that these steps ascend directly into the face of a stone wall. In all of these cases, steps mark points of transition, places where outside becomes inside, where the living meet the ancestral spirits. In this case, steps mark boundaries or borders. This particular stone marks the transition point between Inca territory and that of a once formidable enemy. Owing to the regularity of runners and risers, the transitions that steps signal are orderly and controlled. The profile of steps recall terraces that stabilize steep slopes, allowing for habitation and agriculture, and cascading fountains that slow the downhill rush of water, preventing erosion. I could give dozens of more examples, but the basic point is that carved steps in the landscape mark orderly transitions. So in Inca times, as a visitor approached Saxuaman with its walls of social stone, which was also to approach the Inca's capital, Coyaconcho heralded proximity to the orderly city. It is an extraordinary tired stone for an extraordinary site. A site, remember, that was built to impress, intimidate, and awe. What interests me is that the steps carved into Coyaconcho seem to take advantage of the natural erosion in the stony surface, as though the Inca carvers were following the rock's directions, listening to it, perhaps responding to it. At the very least, they are engaging the outcropping in dialogue. The flights of steps run haphazardly, working against each other at times, and thereby producing a degree of visual confusion. The lack of order here seems to serve as a reminder that the dialogue was ongoing, that the Incas were actively interacting with Coyaconcho, that famously rebellious rock. It will clearly never be a part of Saxuaman's wall, but perhaps it will not kill again. The carvings on Coyaconcho then are records of an ongoing dialogue. They visualize the Inca's ability to interact with an earth being. Coyaconcho works in concert with the nibbled masonry of Saxuaman's walls to demonstrate the Inca's ability to talk to and to negotiate with earth beings. This ability was a key aspect of Inca efforts to persuade other Andean nations to join rather than resist the Inca's imperial ambitions, to be nibbled rather than defiant. There is a language of stone here that is comprehensible if we take indigenous perspectives into account, drawing on metaphoric connections between earth beings and human beings. The Incas crafted their case in stone. They presented what I call a Petrus argument that communicated across the linguistic diversity of the Andes. We may not comprehend all of what they were saying, but I trust my research demonstrates that we can do better than dismissing their rock work as boring, tedious, and unimaginative. In fact, I think the very opposite is true. And with that, I can end my presentation here and entertain any questions that you might have. Okay.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you very much, Lindy. So the homicidal rocks refers
Yes.
to which?
Refers to Coyaconcho, who fell on, right, 3,000 laborers.
Okay, all right. Okay, so questions for Lindy, and you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hi, Lindy, it's Karen.
Oh, there you are. Hi, Karen.
Hey, thank you for a wonderful talk. I've heard you talk about stones before, so it's great to see how the research is progressing. I have two questions. One is historical and the other one, or maybe methodological, I don't know. And the other one, I guess would say it's interpretive. And the first is with respect to these walls, were they found this way in situ, or did the archaeologists put them back together? And the second question is, I'm really taken with the argument that these stone walls, for all of their lack of, for all of their difference, or their variety, I guess I should say, that they're cyclopean walls on the one hand. I guess most of them are cyclopean, even if they're rectangular, they're not the same. So the question in making that the relationship between the walls themselves and the social structure that they are persuading the onlooker of, is that social structure, I would imagine it's quite hierarchical. And so, one could say that the walls are sort of democratic. I mean, being anachronistic and everything else, but, if they're persuasive, each of us fits into our little, cog, I guess would be one way of interpreting that. But if this is a heavily hierarchical culture, and that I don't know, I'm asking the question, how does that fit into the interpretation of these walls as in their persuasiveness? I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay, great questions. I think you started out with, did I lose your question now?
Were they found intact?
Where they found it, right. So these walls, unlike walls built with mortar, which was the Spanish style, this is a region plagued by earthquakes, right? The Andes are still growing. And so walls with mortar are actually quite weak because the mortar, right, cracks and crumbles. These stones don't fall down. So the vast majority of walls that have been diminished were diminished because people in the colonial period took them. So for example, the walls of Saxuaman, all the stones that were sort of readily carryable were used to build things like the cathedral and elite homes, Spanish homes in the city of Cusco. Well, in those cases, the stones have been integrated somewhere else, so they're not going to be taken back and reconstructed. On the other hand, places like Machu Picchu, which weren't known until the 20th century and are heavily touristed, the National Archaeological Institute has tried to put some of those back together. You can see, though, where that is. It's really easy to, if you take some time and look around a site to see where the reconstruction begins. And that hasn't been done to most Inca sites, because it turns out that most tourists want to see about 2 Inca sites, maybe 3 maximum. So the effort has not been, right, to try to reconstruct everything, because there just isn't that kind of interest. The markets are much more interesting to the present day tourist. So Machu Picchu is perhaps the most reconstructed of all.
So when they were originally found, I mean, when these walls were originally come across by these archaeological societies or whoever worked on them, they were intact more or less at that time?
More or less, they'd lost their roofs. The roofs are of perishable grasses. And maybe the first couple of rows, and by first couple, I mean the ones at the top. But largely the walls are standing and they don't fall down. What you might not be able to see is that the joins, I'm just going to use my hands here, the joins, the bottom rock is carved convexly and the top rock is carved concavely, right? So that it's not just a tight fit from the surface, it's a tight fit underneath and on top. So those walls really are incredibly resistant to earthquakes, and they just don't fall down without help from people who want the stones, right? And they are found in churches, in building corrals. I mean, people have used them over the centuries. And then you had a question about hierarchy. The Inca were incredibly hierarchical. And in fact, so hierarchical that, right, the Inca were a separate group that then would grant sort of Inca privileges to people they liked, and not obviously to people they didn't. But in building, I don't want to use too much Quechua, except for Paul, who will enjoy it, that the Inca's empire was Tawantinsuyu. Tawa means 4, Suyu, so the front part and the back part, Tawa and Suyu, mean 4 parts. And they are bound together by a word that is not a word, it's just a connective, Intin, N-T-I-N. And it means like intimately intertwined. And so walls, like their roadways and bridges and systems of warehouses, all of those were manifestations of the Intin of Tawantinsuyu, that those things that bind society together, that intertwine economies. So you have the Incas as the great binders at the top of Inca society, using all of these various mechanisms. And it turns out that stonework was in fact one of the best ways to visualize that, the ways we intertwine different communities that don't speak the same languages, right? Only the Incas can hold them all together. And by the way, just because you do history and I do history, you'll enjoy this. In the 19th century, the French recognized this capability, and they used to have these festivals that celebrated the Inca as the single entity that could unite the entire globe. So the French king was represented, the British king, they had an Asian or China king, but they all marched under the Inca flag. And then, of course, about 10 years later, there that went. But it was Valenciennes in particular, had these wonderful celebrations of the Inca's ability to unite all people. And I'm sure it was in peace and harmony. And I think the people who were united probably wouldn't have, in the Andes, would not have agreed with that. But anyway, did I answer your question? I'm sorry, I'm going on.
So Roger Anderson had a question.
And I have a question.
Yeah,
very interested in your talk. It certainly opens up a lot of things I was not aware of before. But what struck me about your slides is the walls seem to be all uniform color. There are obviously different kinds of rocks, different colors, but not in the same wall. And I'm wondering if the Incas used in any cases rocks of different colors as decoration or as some practical purpose to mark imaginary doorways or whatever. And I'm just curious whether such things can be observed there.
Excellent, excellent question. No, the Incas used rocks from a single quarry to build a single structure. And for sites, except for the capital of Cusco, which does represent a coming together, right? It's the center of those four parts that pull the empire together. It has buildings from different quarries, but like Saxuaman, all made from the same quarry. It's about 21 miles away from the site. Other groups, they did command labor forces, tribute could be paid in labor. And some of those groups constructed walls using like mostly dark basalt, but then they would use some white andesite to make designs in the walls. But the Incas didn't do that. They didn't, their finest walls are all sort of non-imagistic, the same color from the same quarry, which would be much more parallel to a single village working together to build a suspension bridge, which is something the Incas ask of people to do, or to build a road, or to stock a warehouse, that you do this as a group together, contributing to the success of the empire, which is to contribute to everyone's success.
Okay, well, we'll go Shelley and then David Koo. Okay, Shelley,
Bye.
you got to unmute yourself.
That was, oh, sorry, who's
I'm okay.
first?
Oh.
Lindy, that was really I must say, your art historical interpretation and letting us see how much artistry and beauty and work goes into these really sculptural forms. And of course, your is really gorgeous. I mean, now we can look at these things and see that they're very beautiful and very sculptural and very massive. So that was really a pleasure. I was wondering though about these tired stones, because if your thesis is that these walls that have been made of nibbled stones and therefore fit together into a larger cooperative whole, if that is actually a metaphor for the Inca Empire and how it incorporates people, then what happens to these resistant tired stones? Because from what you have written in some of your other work that I know, the outcroppings and the well, any really prominent rock was highly regarded, considered sentient, considered to be present rather than representational, and so on. So, are these resistant, tired, weeping stones? What kinds of emotions, ritual, regard, and treatment do they get, if you would think that they would be symbolic, given your interpretation, of resistant villages or peoples? Yeah, so how are they or were they treated or regarded in relation to the empire and to the walls?
Okay, so for stones like the one at Sawiti, the one I showed you as an example of what I believe is a sculpture, although it wasn't recognized until like sort of the late 20th century, that one, excavations around it have found offerings, and sometimes those offerings are like smooth little stones. Sometimes in in other cases, they're little gold gamitas, little gold llamas, or little gold figures of people, silver as well, shell powder. Nothing is found around tired stones. So for one thing, they're not treated disrespectfully, but they weren't given offerings. And tired stones, including Collaconcho, and this was just something I decided didn't need to be talked about, so I'm very grateful that you asked me. Tired stones sit right by the roadside. So as you are walking right along an Inka road, they're just off the path. They're just off the roadway. And the roadways, of course, are not beautiful, sort of cobblestone prepared. And these rocks are sort of out in with grass growing around them. And so they're alone, right? They're not back in their quarry. They're isolated. They have no support system, right?
Oh.
And so they're like this, they're so emblematic of the benefits of belonging to a society, right? Of being part of a larger social unit with all of its security, right? Inka armies to protect you, Inka warehouses that will feed you if you have a drought. And that was one of the great benefits of belonging to the Inca Empire, is that you would be fed in a time of need. You would be taken care of in a time of earthquake. But boy, those tired stones, they're just there all by themselves, no company, right? So they actually are quite emblematic, but not in a way that people would have stopped and given them an offering, sort of in gratitude. They're a different kind of monument.
Okay, David, you had a
Interesting.
question, and unmute yourself.
Just comment back to Shelley. I think of a tired stone as one in which there's sympathy given to them rather than being strong and resistant. And therefore, I think it's consistent with their being left alone or whatever, as Carolyn would say. So, but actually, my question was related to the surfaces of these steps and whether they were flat in such a way that if you put something on them as adornment, or if you're standing there, they could serve as a platform. And so that depends upon whether they're heights above the caves, they would allow people to stand, or is there some possibility they served a purpose? If they're flat relative to gravity, I would say that they took care to allow it to be a platform. If they're just, they're all different angles where things can wobble off, then I can imagine them not being so functional. I'm just curious whether there's some additional functionality rather than just as steps to say the lead from one place to another, but they can serve as platforms for adornment or for people of power or whatever, offerings, etc.
Right. Well, first of all, just to be clear, we don't have any good documentation of the way the Incas used their rocks. That was not something the Spanish bothered to write down, and it's not recorded in any of the indigenous sources. But first of all, I would say that steps do in fact serve a purpose, right? They mark you're at a place of transition. So they are like a big flashing sign, right? So whether they're functional or not, they serve an important use. Most of them, in fact, the way I define steps, because in studying carved motifs, I tried to find descriptive language. So for me, a step has a horizontal runner and a vertical riser. And so they are more or less horizontal, vertical, and there have to be at least 2 runners and 2 risers to constitute a step. Right? If you take that as a definition of a step is the most frequently carved form, and then flat spaces, which I have now been quoted as coming up with the term flat space. I thought I was merely being descriptive, but flat spaces are the second, right, spaces where you might leave an offering. And feeding rocks is something that was done, as well as giving them textiles, which are precious, very precious textiles, which are then burned. So that's probably what happened on flat spaces, where you could give an offering to a rock. And Collaconcho seems to have hovered sort of on that line between tired stone and sacred rock. But no offerings have been found around it. So it looks like its primary function, right, was to announce that you're approaching this great and glorious site that was built to be the sort of be all and end all of Inca architectural structures.
Okay.
So thank you so much.
Paul had a question. And unmute.
Unmute myself. Carolyn, thank you. That was a marvelous talk. I have three little observations. One, on the homicidal stone, all those steps cut into it, do we know, I mean, was that a form of quarrying, or is it just, are the missing bits somewhere? Do we know where they went? Are they used somewhere else? Are they taken away to the main walls? Or do we know, is there any way of tracing the stone to see if it's somewhere else? That's the first bit of my question.
Okay.
The second is that the more you talked about the sort of inclusive idea of belonging to a sort of Inca crossword puzzle of stone where everything interlocks, the more I thought, and it's years since I studied the Quechua language and spent time in Peru, but it reminded me so much of Inca grammar, which is highly inflected. It's an agglutinative language, the same chunks for plurals, or as you mentioned, for the interlinking word. I mean, the language itself locks together in a remarkable way, the grammar of Quechua. And I wondered if you had thought at all about the relationship between the way the stone works and the way their own language worked and continues to work. And my third observation is that perhaps the Emeriti Association should be renamed the Tired Stones.
I don't know, you all fit rather well in this row of parallelepipeds that I see here in the Brady Bunch kind of view. So let's see.
The missing chunks.
The missing chunks, that has been a question. There doesn't seem to be a way other than to source, it's the same kind of stone. The stone from Saxuaman is mostly not local, and generally the chunks taken out would have been on the top layers. So those would have been removed and are like in the Cathedral of Cusco probably. It's sort of hard to track that kind of thing. In general, those blocks that are cut out are very much like what I call emplacements. They're the areas carved out of natural stone where the Incas usually would put a square block.
Yeah.
Right. So they're integrating their built environment with the natural environment. And where they're just left blank are usually on places that are alongside or close to roadways, with the idea being that they signal the Inca presence there. So these are places that where oversight is exercised. A bit of a sort of complex argument, but it seems lots of times those are called seats, but they weren't necessarily sat on by anybody ever. But it's the idea that where there's a chair, somebody might sit. And so on Coyoconcho are actually two huge seats that where people, if they do wander over, like to have their pictures taken. But those are usually signs that of oversight, either of the stone, right? That's its location and it's looking back at you. And that is the connection to Quechua, Runashimi, where the language also has built into it a sense of perspective, so that you can give a very long explanation if you're living in a village about how something came to be and how something was in very strong and firm language, in a very strong and firm voice. And then they'll end it with this little phrase that says, well, that's what they say. Right? So that there's always sort of an acknowledgement that when something is hearsay or when you actually saw it yourself. And it's a bit like that inclusive we and exclusive we,
Yes.
which you probably wished it too when you studied Quechua. That wouldn't it be nice if English had that?
Exactly.
This we that you use a particular form of the verb that means me and you and everybody else that's around here that I'm talking about. That's the inclusive we. But then I could also say, we're going to the store later. And you know, you're not coming to the store with me, so I must mean my husband. But the Quechua has a special verb tense for that, or verb form for that, so that you can tell somebody we, meaning me and somebody else, but it doesn't include you.
Without being rude too.
Right, without being rude.
We're going out for dinner.
Yeah.
But you're not coming. But you can do it.
You're not part of the we that's going out to dinner. Yeah. And so the Inca language not only has these connectors which tie things together explicitly, but also a way of introducing perspective so that you're either part of the belonging group or you're not part of the belonging group. And all of that seems to be articulated in visual culture as well. You can find all of these parallels. The other prominent one is the way that Quechua identify like particular names for that place between the eyebrow. I guess we just call it like the unibrow or lack thereof. This place where we have a word for that. I don't remember it because we never use it. Quechua use it all the time. The place between the shoulder blades, right? So places that come together are also pronounced in Quechua. And it's something you notice sort of immediately when you study the language, is that they're really interested in things that unite other things, or in places of joining, of coming together. And so that's part of the sort of larger argument about the importance of stairs, where runner meets riser, right? That there is this constant sense of when things are brought together, something special happens. Yeah. So yes, Quechua is a fascinating language. And we are lucky now that there is a person on campus who teaches Quechua. So my graduate students have somebody to study with, which is really nice.
Okay, there were a couple of other questions. Jim?
Bud Bridges.
Okay, Jim, and Bud, you go first, then
Okay.
Jim, and then Peter.
I enjoyed the talk very much. I'm sorry I missed the first part of it. My question relates to some of the walls I've seen in the vicinity of Cusco, which are much bigger walls made with massive stones. Yet they are carved the same way, it looks like. They fit intimately. And the question I've had is, how can they move such big stones and get them to fit that well? It's unlike the pyramids in Egypt, which are flat, and you can imagine them grinding them easily. So that's the first part of the question. And are these walls actually of these bigger stones built locally, or do they have to move stones a long way? And if they did the latter, how do they move them?
Well, Saxuaman, the site I was talking about, is right above Cusco, and that's where the largest, the megaliths are found. The other site is Ollantaytambo. For both of them, the quarries are over 20 miles away. In the two colonial period drawings I showed, one from Martin de Murua and the other from Felipe Wamampoma, those both show the Inca technique that was in fact documented by Spanish witnesses, as well as written about by indigenous people. The stones are roughed out in the quarry, so they have flat bottoms. And then a rope is tied around them. And I think both of those images showed 2 or 3 laborers moving them. Hundreds of people moved those stones. But it turns out that the roads were cobblestone, and you can drag a stone that has been smoothed, right? It doesn't have rough edges, along cobblestones fairly easily. And there have been several anthropologists who have done experiments with moving stone. And provided the stone is roughed off and the roadbed is clear, A lot of them are now covered in dirt, and you can't drag a heavy stone through the dirt. It's just going to sink into the soil. But if your roadbed is covered with stones, as the Incas were, and the stone has been smoothed, travel is not that difficult, as long as you have enough labor to do it. And I think the one account we have of an actually fairly observant Spaniard comments that when Saxuaman was being built, there were always a minimum of 30,000 laborers working on the site at any one time. So sort of massive labor, which again, only an imperial kind of state, only a very hierarchical state can actually assemble. The stones, so getting the stones to the site, the megaliths to the site, not that difficult. We understand how that was done. We understand how the bottom row of megaliths was worked and put together through this process of nibbling that I talked about. It's the stones that weigh many tons.
Right.
Getting those up, which would be several stories. Well, they built ramps. We know that. They built just piling up dirt from the neighborhood. Okay, so you can drag the stone up that. But then to fit it in the way that nibbling works, you have to do an approximation and then set it in place and then see where it doesn't quite settle and work that stone. And it's that process of placing and sort of taking away and refitting that seems almost impossible to imagine how much labor and effort went into it. And I think that is part of what engineers, and there are a number of archaeologists and engineers who were working on this problem. I think that's what they're still sort of trying to figure out. We do know, however, it was not extraterrestrials. Right? One conclusion that we can say for sure is the Incas did it, just not exactly sure how they did it, unless we want to take seriously the notion that they expended a lot of labor because there was some kind of payoff, that this sort of excessive use of rock did really redound to their benefit in some way, is persuading people to cooperate, to pay tribute, to contribute to the labor of building a wall.
Okay.
It's impressive how fine those joints are.
Yeah, they're in some of the later structures, the joins are really good. The horizontal joints are really good, but the vertical joins are just on the surface and they've sort of filled the inside with sort of rubble.
Oh, okay.
Which still keeps the stone, as long as the stones on top and the bottom are well joined, everything's fine. But they did apparently take some shortcuts a little later on as they were building more buildings. You know, they got up into Ecuador and down into Chile and over into Argentina. They began taking a few shortcuts with their high status masonry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jim Gill.
Carolyn, anybody who's like, I'm a geologist, anybody who's worked with as a career with stone knows how intransigent they are. Or anyone who's sculpted a stone, you know, think of carving jade in China, how they do what the stone tells them to do, not what they want to impose on the stone. So you started with the interplay between the indigenous stone left in the wall with masonry around it. So my question is about Coya Concha. Is it, in fact, what's the evidence that it moved? What is it an indigenous stone? Because it's megalithic with the emphasis on nega, right?
No,
So-
it's a rock outcropping. It's a rock outcropping. Right, so it didn't move. Well,
Yeah.
at least from our point of view, it didn't move. So
So
the
it's not
evidence
from the
is,
same quarry.
pardon?
It's not from the same quarry.
No, and
Yeah.
it's not part of the walls, which are what I identified as being from the same quarry. So it is an indigenous stone and it's the oral narrative. And again, as I said, we never would have identified it as a tired stone were it not for the fact that there are 6 stories from indigenous sources written in the 16th and early 17th centuries that all say that stone is Coya Concho. and then tell the rest of the story about it resisting and killing. And that it really is the strength of the oral narrative that let us know that the Incas conceived of it and talked about it as a tired stone, but that it is also really distinctively different from all of the other tired stones. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Peter Scott.
Yeah, I have a question from an ignoramus, which is anything known about the tools that were used to shape the stones so exactly?
Yes, hammer, I think I gave a brief sort of hammer stones decreasing in size. Most of those are river rock. And they've been found in the quarries as well as at construction sites. So you'd start out with a hammerstone that was as much as a laborer could hold, right? And you slam it down on the stone, and people have replicated this in contemporary times to get huge chunks off. And then you get smaller and smaller and smaller, the more the stone is worked, until finally, to get those inside corners, right, you're using a guitar pick size stone. So a little tiny stone chipping, right, gnawing away or nibbling away at the stone, the bedding joint, as well as the stone you're working, to get that incredibly close fit. And that's why the stones that are, you know, 2 or 3 people can move, you can see how they were placed, refit, re-nibbled, placed back, taken away, nibbled again. But it's those large, the megaliths, that really are quite astonishing if they were taking that much time to work those stones. But it's all stone on stone.
So there were no hammers and chisels and anything like that.
The stone is itself the hammer, so hammer stone.
Oh, okay. Huh.
Okay, Virginia, you had a question.
Well, I had a question about transportation, which you've already answered. That was a great talk too. Very clear as well. So with the megastones, how did they get underneath to make them smooth in order to move them?
Okay, so most Inca, what we call quarries, are actually rock falls. So,
oh, okay.
Right, sorry, we just use the term quarries, but yeah, there are places where the earth has already given over a bunch of rocks for use by human beings. And so in the quarries, we found the hammer stones that they would use then to sort of rough out the stone, take off its rough edges that might catch. And
so the bottom and, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
So the bottom might actually have been a side to start with.
Could have been.
Yeah,
right.
Okay.
They get them to the site, and then that's where the working to fit in a single spot happens. It all happens at the site, not in the quarry or at the rockfall.
No, what I wanted to know was at the quarry, how did they get underneath to make it smooth, to make it move?
Well, you could do the top side, right? You do the top side and then.
But then you had to flip it.
Right, and roll it on. But if you notice the tired stones that I showed, there were what, 4 or 5 of them? They're sort of roughed out top, bottom, and 4 sides.
Right.
So that whichever way the stone goes, you can tie a rope around it and pull it.
Okay.
Right. I had a question, Lindy. So this technology must have taken years, decades, centuries to develop. So are there sites that show older, less precise, more primitive steps in the development of this whole technique? Or does it just appear?
Yeah, that's why the extraterrestrials. There is an earlier group around 500 to around 1,000 of the Common Era, so 500 years before the rise of the Incas, that used megaliths, but they did not work stone the way the Incas did. So the Incas were inspired by them. They were sort of headquartered in what is today Bolivia, the Tiwanaku people. they were joins, like they joined their stones with use of silver that they poured in to form links. So the stone working, the technique is actually very different. But the Inca were clearly inspired by that stonework, the use of megaliths. They were very impressed by that, but they developed their own techniques and their own ways of working stone. They did, when they integrated that part of Bolivia into their empire, they demanded a lot of masons come work for the Inca state. So they did recognize that these are people who sort of know how to work with the natural, the ways that stones will naturally break, that understand the way to work a stone with stone tools. And so borrowed that expertise, but not the technology, not the techniques for joining and fitting. That they apparently developed over about 100 years on their own.
Okay, I saw a couple more hands. Phyllis? And then Galen. Okay, Phyllis?
Okay, in those old paintings you showed of Colaconcho that let you know it was a tired stone, it was so small compared to how big it really is. Is there any explanation for that?
Probably just to fit on the page, right? Artists do that all the time. You can change proportions to fit things on a page. I particularly like the one where it's the one by the indigenous artist, where the Inca captain is actually standing on the stone, and what he's yelling at the workers who are pulling the stone and himself is like, onward men, onward. So there's a sort of sense of the Inca ability to get laborers and stones to do exactly what they want. The other one has the Inca captain up on a hill, sort of supervising the whole exercise. And in fact, if you look at that stone carefully, it's actually lying, what we would say if the Inca were a person, lying on its back from the way the eyes are drawn. And so it's looking up plaintively at the captain because he doesn't want to move. But those are done, I mean, those are narrative illustrations, and they're not meant to be accurate presentations of what the stone looked like. And in fact, we don't know that Waman actually knew Coyaconcho, because the sources that identify the stone by name are local, and Felipe Waman himself was from central Peru. So he may just have known it by name, but not actually what the particular stone looked like. If that makes any sense.
Okay, Galen, and unmute yourself, Galen. Okay, no, you're still on there.
Oh yeah, there. Oh, okay, I wanted to see. Yeah, oh, Carolyn, what a fascinating talk and slides and pictures. I was wondering, in one of your slides, you showed the mountains being very kind of symmetrical zigzag shapes themselves in the far distance. And do you think the Incas were inspired by the shapes of the Andes peaks themselves, perhaps? Maybe.
That is something that others have pointed out. Like I think one of our intro textbooks makes quite a big deal of that. Makes sense that because in every Quechua village that I've worked in, the first thing after meeting elders is they will always, and usually like take me by the shoulders because I don't move fast enough, apparently. I can't breathe at that altitude, but they'll sort of physically move you around and point out the highest mountain on the horizon.
Oh, yeah.
So they're very conscious. And again, the mountains have a perspective. So in a village, you need to know who's looking at you, who has oversight, and mountains have oversight. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. We just have no sort of documentation from writings in the colonial period that say that's the case, but it sounds right. It sort of sounds right and looks right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any
wonderful talk.
Urgent last question here? I guess we'll let Paul, you can ask.
We've talked a lot about how they were put together. the vast walls of Saxuaman, for example. But what were they for? Because there's always a, you know, a relation between walls. People, you know, in ancient Europe and medieval Europe, you lived behind them, and there's a relationship between warfare and walls. But these walls look as if they would resist a whole line of tanks. And were they more emblematic, symbolic, or were they actually a response to a particular kind of warfare?
Well, Saxuaman in part functioned as a fortress, and it was a warehouse. Spaniards report, you know, because they were always looking for stockpiles of precious things, and they report finding nothing but the little stones that were used in the Inca's slingshot weapons and sandals for the military and other sort of military outfitting, which, you know, Spaniards didn't consider particularly important. But so it clearly was a sort of warehouse or storage facility for the military. That suggests that, in fact, those walls were built to catch any approaching enemy in the crossfire. And what's probably important about Saxuaman is also its position overlooking the city, that if you're going to attack Cusco, owning that piece of territory is really important. And in fact, it played an important role during an Inca uprising where the Spaniards in the city were very nearly killed by the Inca rebels who occupied Saxuaman. You know, so it is clearly a strategic, sort of a militarily strategic vantage point. And those big walls were probably designed to be functional, right? Is to give a siege point. And there's a water tower so that a military could hang out there under siege for a while. But it was never actually used until the colonial period. There wasn't any enemy army coming all the way into Cusco. And so we have to imagine that it was also for intimidation, to sort of convince people not even to try. Anyone who might have rebellious sentiments, yeah, don't even try messing with us.
Because you can't even fire an arrow through them. You can't look through them.
No, that's, and in fact, yeah, the Spaniards had a terrible time. They sacrificed many people securing Saxuaman from the rebels.
Okay, well, folks, I think we've about come to the end. Lindy, I think you covered it all. We've had art, engineering, geology, politics, and linguistics, at least in that talk. Quite the Renaissance scholar. So thank you very much. And we will not meet in December, but I hope to see all of you again in January. And you can always watch our website. It has anything comes up, and pay attention to the Retiring Emeriti newsletter that Christy puts out, and find out the progress we're making in dealing with our RASC problems. So thank you, everybody. And it's a good session. Great.